There is a city that never truly sleeps, a place of steel and stone and light that hums quietly through the darkest hours of the night. New York spreads itself out beneath you now like a map of everything human beings have ever wanted. The towers and the tenements, the bridges strung with their patient strings of light, the rivers moving darkly at the edges of everything. It is a city of ambition and of consequence, a place where fortunes are made and lost and made again, where the line between brilliance and obsession is sometimes thinner than it appears. Tonight we are going to follow one story that lives at the heart of that city, the story of a man who built an empire and lost himself inside it, the story of how greatness curdled into madness and what it cost everyone who loved him. Settle in now. Let the city fall quiet around you. There is no hurry here, no urgency, only the long and careful telling of a story that deserves to be understood rather than simply remembered. We begin, as so many important stories do, not with a monster, but with a man. The building that bore the Osborn name stood at the edge of Midtown Manhattan, like a declaration of intent, its upper floors catching the morning light a full hour before the streets below emerged from shadow. To anyone who passed it in those early years, the Oscorp Tower represented the particular kind of American confidence that belongs to people who have decided the world will make room for them whether it wishes to or not. The lobbies were marble and glass. The laboratories on the upper floors hummed with expensive equipment, and the quiet concentration of some of the most talented scientific minds that money and reputation could attract. The name on the building was not inherited. It had not come down through generations of accumulated wealth or social connection. It had been chosen, constructed, and placed there by a single man who had decided in his early 20s that his name would one day mean something, and who had spent every year since making certain that it did. Norman Virgil Osborn was, in the years of Oscorp's greatest prominence, a figure that New York understood instinctively and admired without reservation. He was photographed at charity dinners and civic ceremonies, quoted in the financial pages of the major newspapers, referenced in conversations about the future of American manufacturing and chemical research, as though his presence in those industries was simply a natural feature of the landscape, like the Hudson River or the skyline itself. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself with the kind of contained physical authority that makes height irrelevant, his shoulders always square, his expression always slightly ahead of the conversation, as though he had already considered what you were about to say and found it interesting enough to hear out. His hair, dark in his younger years, and silver at the temples by the time Oscorp reached the height of its influence, was always immaculate. His suits were expensive without being ostentatious. He had the appearance of a man who had learned long ago exactly how he wanted to present himself to the world, and had simply never stopped performing that presentation. The public story of how Oscorp came to be was the kind of narrative that 1960s America told about itself with particular fondness. The story of the self-made man, the boy from nothing who built something through intelligence and will alone. And the broad outlines of that story were true enough. Norman had grown up in circumstances that offered very little in the way of material comfort or emotional security, in a household where money was always scarce, and the atmosphere was shaped by a father whose frustrations found their expression in unpredictable ways. The details of those early years Norman rarely discussed and never dwelt upon in public, but they were present in him the way that early experiences are always present. Not as memories that surface in conversation, but as the invisible architecture beneath everything he built. The hunger that drove him was not metaphorical. He had known what it meant to go without, to wear clothes that were not quite right, to understand from a very young age that the world sorted people into categories, and that the category you were born into had a gravitational pull that required extraordinary effort to escape. What Norman had from the beginning was his mind. His teachers noticed it early, that particular quality of intelligence that is not merely quick but genuinely original, the kind that does not simply learn what it is taught, but immediately begins to question, extend, and reorganize what it has absorbed. He was drawn to chemistry with the intensity of someone who has found the subject that makes sense of everything else, who sees in the behavior of molecules and reactions a kind of fundamental truth about the way the world operates at its most basic level. The high school laboratory became, in his adolescent years, the place where he felt most fully himself, most free of the weight of home and circumstance. Among beakers and formulae and the clean logic of chemical equations, Norman Osborn experienced something that resembled peace. Though he would not have used that word, he would have said he experienced clarity. The years at university were the first time that Norman encountered people whose intelligence genuinely matched his own, and the experience was both exhilarating and quietly threatening. He thrived academically in ways that attracted the attention of his professors and the cautious respect of his peers, but he also developed, during those years, the first clear outlines of a characteristic that would define him throughout his life: the inability to tolerate being second. It was not simple competitiveness, though it expressed itself in competitive terms. It was something deeper and more uncomfortable than that, a kind of existential anxiety about rank and recognition that had its roots in the powerlessness of his childhood home. To be first, to be acknowledged as best, was not vanity but necessity. It was the proof, renewed constantly and never finally established, that he had escaped the category he was born into, that he had become something irreversibly different from the frightened boy in the ill-fitting clothes. It was at university that Norman met Mendel Stromm, and their friendship, genuine in its early years, became the partnership on which Oscorp was eventually founded. Stromm was a brilliant chemist with a gift for theoretical work and a corresponding lack of interest in the commercial applications that fascinated Norman. They complemented each other in ways that made their collaboration productive almost immediately, Norman's drive and organizational intelligence providing the framework within which Stromm's more discursive genius could function. They spent long evenings in graduate laboratories working on problems that neither of them had been assigned, following lines of inquiry that interested them simply because they were interesting, building the kind of intellectual trust that forms the foundation of genuine scientific partnership. Norman, in later years, would rarely speak of those evenings, but there is reason to believe they represented something real to him. Something that existed outside his usual calculations of advantage and return. The founding of Oscorp in the mid-1950s was accomplished with a combination of Stromm's scientific reputation, Norman's business acumen, and capital assembled through a series of negotiations whose details Norman kept carefully to himself. They began with contracts for the manufacture of chemical compounds used in industrial processes, work that was unglamorous but financially stable, and expanded gradually into research and development, into military contracts, into the kind of government adjacency that brought both money and scrutiny. Norman managed the external relationships, the clients, the contractors, the regulatory bodies, while Stromm oversaw the laboratory operations. For a time, the arrangement functioned as well as either of them could have hoped. Norman's marriage to Emily came during these early years of Oscorp's growth, and it brought into his life a warmth and stability that he had not previously known how to seek or accept. Emily was a quiet woman, with a considerable intelligence of her own, and a genuine capacity for affection that did not demand performance in return. She loved Norman in a way that did not require him to be always excellent, always correct, always the most capable person in the room, and in the privacy of their home in those early years, something in him was able to respond to that. Their son Harold, who would always be Harry to everyone who loved him, was born when Norman was in his early 30s, and the arrival of the child produced in Norman a feeling that he could not quite name and did not entirely know what to do with, a tenderness that frightened him slightly, as though it represented a vulnerability he had not consented to acquire. Harry grew up in houses that were comfortable, then impressive, then grand. As Oscorp's fortunes expanded through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, he was a cheerful, affectionate child with his mother's ease in the world and, to Norman's complicated satisfaction, something of his father's quick intelligence. The family photographs from those years, which would eventually end up in boxes in the Osborn mansion storage rooms, show a boy who looks happy, a mother who looks at her son with uncomplicated love, and a father who is almost always slightly turned away from the camera, his gaze directed at something outside the frame, as though already attending to the next thing, the next problem, the next proof of his own importance. Those photographs, taken as a record of family happiness, captured instead the earliest signs of a distance that would only grow. Emily's death, when Harry was still a small boy, removed from Norman's life the one relationship that had asked something genuinely different of him, that had offered him the possibility of being loved for what he was rather than what he achieved. The grief that followed was real, though Norman expressed it in the only vocabulary available to him, which was the vocabulary of work. He threw himself into Oscorp with an intensity that made the company's subsequent growth almost inevitable, and in doing so he left Harry, in those most formative years, in the care of a succession of housekeepers and family friends, visited by a father who arrived in the evenings with the distracted energy of someone whose mind had not yet left the office. Harry waited for those evenings with a patience and hopefulness that was, in its own way, one of the quiet tragedies of the Osborn family story. He waited, and he hoped, and he learned, very gradually, that what his father had to offer was given according to a logic that Harry could not quite master. That love in that household was a conditional resource whose conditions were never fully explained. By the time Oscorp's tower was casting its shadow over Midtown Manhattan, Norman Osborn had built very nearly everything he had promised himself he would build. The company was profitable, respected, and expanding into new areas of research that kept his own scientific interests engaged. His name appeared on the boards of charitable foundations and civic organizations. He was the kind of man that other ambitious men studied and emulated, the kind whose trajectory served as evidence that the category you are born into is not necessarily the category you die in. And yet there was, in those years of greatest external success, something in Norman Osborn that was not satisfied, that moved through his achievements the way a cold current moves through apparently still water, invisible at the surface but present and significant beneath. He had built the kingdom. He had put his name on the building. And still, somewhere in the part of him that had never quite left that childhood house, the proof felt incomplete, the distance from where he had begun not quite sufficient, the world's acknowledgement not quite loud enough to drown out what he had always been afraid was true about himself. It was this feeling, patient and corrosive and entirely private, that the formula in Mendel Stromm's research files would eventually find and make use of. But that discovery still lay ahead. For now, Norman Osborn stood at the height of everything he had constructed and looked out over his city with the expression of a man who has almost everything he ever wanted and cannot understand why almost is not enough. The surface of a life, however polished, is never the whole of it. What Norman Osborn presented to the world in those years of Oscorp's ascendancy, the composed executive, the civic benefactor, the man whose name appeared in the right columns of the right publications, was real in the way that surfaces are real, which is to say it was true as far as it went and incomplete in ways that mattered enormously. To understand how a man of his intelligence and capability arrived at the place he eventually arrived, it is necessary to travel further back than the founding of Oscorp, further back than the university laboratories and the early partnership with Stromm, back to the household where Norman Osborn first learned what the world was and what his place in it might be. That household was not a cruel place in any simple or dramatic sense. It was something more complicated than cruelty, and in some ways more difficult to survive, because it offered just enough warmth to create hope, and just enough unpredictability to ensure that hope was never entirely safe. Norman's father, Ambrose Osborn, was a man whose own life had not gone as he had intended, and who had not developed the psychological resources to carry that disappointment without allowing it to spill onto the people around him. He had possessed, in his younger years, a genuine facility for invention and mechanical problem-solving that he had believed would translate into commercial success, into the kind of stable and respected life that the post-war years seemed to promise to men with useful skills and sufficient determination. It had not translated. The business ventures he attempted failed in ways that were sometimes his fault, and sometimes simply the result of bad timing or bad luck, and Ambrose Osborn was not a man who could distinguish easily between the two, or who was inclined to assign much weight to the category of bad luck when the category of personal failure was available. He turned his disappointments inward first, and then, with increasing frequency as Norman grew older, outward, toward the family that depended on him and that he experienced, in his darker periods, as an audience for his inadequacy. The household operated according to rhythms that Norman learned to read, with the particular accuracy that children develop when accuracy is a matter of emotional safety. There were good periods, sometimes extended ones, during which Ambrose was engaged and present and capable of the kind of fatherly attention that Norman stored carefully, as though against future scarcity. And there were the other periods, arrived at without reliable warning, during which the atmosphere of the house changed in ways that everyone in it felt and no one acknowledged directly. Norman learned, during those years, to be very quiet and very observant, to anticipate rather than react, to position himself always slightly ahead of whatever was coming. He learned that the world was a place where conditions shifted without announcement, and that the only reliable protection was one's own intelligence applied continuously and without rest. It was not a lesson that any child should have to learn, and it was not a lesson that left him easily. What Ambrose Osborn did give his son, in the complicated ledger of what parents give their children, was a respect for intelligence that was genuine even when everything else was not. He recognized Norman's academic gifts early, and took a pride in them that was one of the cleaner emotions available in that household. Norman's reports from school, invariably excellent, were the occasions on which his father's approval was most reliably present, most expressed, most warm. It was a form of conditional love, though neither of them would have used those words, and it inscribed itself in Norman with a precision that shaped the rest of his life. Achievement was the currency of affection. Excellence was the price of safety. To be the best, the most capable, the most recognized, was not vanity but survival, not ambition, but the deeply learned response of a child who had discovered that his mind was the one thing about him that reliably produced the response he needed from the person whose approval mattered most. The years of Norman's adolescence were marked by a discipline and focus that his teachers admired and his peers found somewhat unnerving. While other boys his age were navigating the social landscape of high school with the usual combination of enthusiasm and awkwardness, Norman was working with a quality of concentration that belonged more naturally to an adult, or to someone for whom the ordinary pleasures of youth were simply less urgent than the goal that lay ahead. He was not friendless, and he was not, in the conventional sense, unhappy, but there was a part of him that remained always slightly apart, always calculating the distance between where he was and where he intended to be, always measuring the gap between the circumstances of his present life and the life he had decided he would have. This quality of perpetual forward orientation, of treating the present as merely the anteroom to a more acceptable future, was one that served him extraordinarily well in certain respects and cost him dearly in others, though the cost would not become fully apparent for many years. Chemistry presented itself to Norman not as a subject among subjects, but as something closer to a revelation. He encountered it first in a high school laboratory that was modest by any measure, equipped with the kind of basic apparatus that could demonstrate fundamental reactions, but not much more. It did not matter. What the laboratory gave him was the experience of a domain governed entirely by principles that were discoverable, learnable, and ultimately controllable by anyone with sufficient intelligence and patience to understand them. In chemistry, outcomes followed from causes according to rules that did not shift based on mood or circumstance, did not withhold themselves arbitrarily, or arrive without warning. The molecular world was, in this sense, the opposite of the household Norman had grown up in, and its appeal to him was not merely intellectual but deeply, almost physically reassuring. He spent hours in that modest laboratory, beyond what any assignment required, repeating experiments not because he had failed to understand them, but because the process itself, the careful preparation, the precise execution, the predictable result, was something he needed. His facility with the subject attracted the attention of a teacher named Mr. Farrow, a man in his middle years who had sacrificed a potentially distinguished research career for the more immediate satisfactions of teaching, and who recognized in Norman a quality of scientific intuition that he had not encountered in a student before. Farrow became the first person outside Norman's immediate family to offer him consistent, uncomplicated encouragement, and Norman received it with a hunger that was somewhat humbling to witness. He stayed after school. He read beyond the curriculum. He began, in his junior year, to formulate questions that went beyond what the high school laboratory could address. Questions about the behavior of complex organic molecules, about the potential for chemical processes to alter biological systems in controlled and beneficial ways. These were not the questions of a diligent student mastering his material. They were the questions of a scientist beginning to think. The relationship with his father during these years grew more complicated as Norman's obvious trajectory diverged from anything Ambrose had managed to achieve. The pride remained, and Norman held on to it carefully. But alongside the pride there was something else now, something that expressed itself in subtle diminishments and sudden withdrawals of warmth that Norman could not always predict or explain. He learned to present his achievements with a certain modesty in his father's presence, to understate rather than celebrate to calibrate his visible success to a level that would produce pride without producing its complicated underside. This calibration became habitual and then instinctive, and eventually Norman was no longer entirely conscious that he was doing it, only aware of the persistent low anxiety that accompanied any situation in which his capabilities were on display and the response of the audience was uncertain. When Norman left for university, the distance from his father's house produced in him a relief that he felt guilty about, and a freedom that he did not quite know how to inhabit. The first years of university life were, in some respects, the most genuinely happy of his adult life, though happiness was not a word he used with any frequency or comfort. He was among people who valued what he valued, in an environment that rewarded the qualities he had spent his entire childhood developing, in a laboratory that was large and well-equipped, and filled with problems worthy of the intelligence he brought to them. The discovery that other people found him interesting, not merely impressive but genuinely interesting, that conversations with him produced the kind of intellectual excitement that serious people find nourishing, was something he absorbed slowly and with a residual wariness, as though expecting the conditions to change without notice. The friendships he formed at university were real, and if somewhat bounded by his difficulty with vulnerability and his tendency to experience intimacy primarily through shared intellectual work rather than through the more exposed kinds of personal exchange. With Stromm in particular, he found a relationship that worked partly because Stromm was not especially interested in the emotional dimensions of friendship and was entirely interested in the scientific ones. They could spend an evening working on a problem together and emerge from it having shared something genuine, without having had to navigate the territory that Norman found most difficult. It was not a complete form of friendship, but it was a form that Norman could sustain without the constant management that other relationships seemed to require. Emily, when she came into his life in those early Oscorp years, offered him something he had not expected and was not sure he deserved, which was the experience of being loved in a way that did not primarily require him to perform. She was patient with him in ways that were not passive, that came from a genuine understanding of where his difficulties originated, and a decision to work around them rather than demand that he resolve them on her schedule. She found him funny, which surprised him. She found his intensity endearing rather than exhausting, which surprised him more. In her presence he was able, for periods that were sometimes quite extended, to set down the perpetual forward calculation, the constant measurement of distance between present and intended, and simply be in a room with another person without managing his impression of that person or that person's impression of him. Harry, arriving into this arrangement, was the beneficiary of it, at least in those early years, at least while Emily was alive to hold the warmth in place. Her loss, arriving when Harry was still very young, collapsed something in Norman that had been quietly structural, load-bearing in ways he had not understood, until the weight it carried had nowhere else to go. He did not grieve in any of the ways that grief counsellors or well-meaning friends might have recommended, because grief of that kind, grief that admitted dependency and loss, and the terrifying openness of need, was not available to him in any form he knew how to access. What was available to him was work, and the further development of the qualities that work rewarded: precision, control, the imposition of order on recalcitrant material. Oscorp expanded in the years after Emily's death with a momentum that was partly the natural result of good management, and partly the result of a man pouring everything he could not otherwise express into the one domain where he reliably knew what to do. Harry was 7 years old when his mother died, and 9 when it became clear to him, in the wordless way that children understand these things, that his father was not coming back to him in the way he had briefly been present. Norman was there, physically present in the house with a regularity that represented genuine effort given his schedule, but the version of his father that Harry encountered most often in those years was the version that had closed itself off from the kind of exchange that Harry most needed. Norman could help with homework, he could attend school events, he could provide, with admirable consistency, the material circumstances of a comfortable life. What he could not reliably provide was the sense that Harry's inner life, his fears, his small joys, his need to be known rather than simply provided for, was something that his father had the bandwidth to receive. Harry learned, as children learn these things, to need less than he actually needed, to make himself smaller and less demanding, in the hope that what he was offered would feel like enough if he adjusted his expectations sufficiently. It did not feel like enough. It would not feel like enough for a very long time. Norman, for his part, was not without awareness that something in his relationship with his son was not right. He felt it in the particular discomfort that Harry's uncomplicated affection produced in him, the way the boy's obvious need for closeness activated an anxiety that Norman could not name and therefore could not address. He loved Harry in the way that people love people they cannot fully reach, with a frustrated tenderness that expressed itself in provision and planning rather than presence, in the accumulated material evidence of care rather than in the moments of attention that Harry was actually asking for. He told himself, in the quiet internal arguments that he sometimes had on the subject, that he was building something for Harry, something permanent and significant that would outlast both of them, and that Harry would one day understand and appreciate. This was true as far as it went. It did not go far enough. What Norman Osborn carried into the years of Oscorp's great expansion then was not simply ambition or scientific brilliance, though he carried both of those in abundance. He carried the unresolved architecture of a childhood in which love had been conditional and approval contingent, in which safety had required constant vigilance and excellence had been the price of affection. He carried the loss of the one relationship that had offered him something different, and the guilt of having been unable to let that relationship fully remake him before it was taken away. He carried a son who needed more from him than he knew how to give, and the knowledge of that inadequacy, which he kept carefully beneath the surface of his daily competence the way that certain geological pressures are kept beneath the surface of apparently stable ground. These were not forces that had yet found their expression, but they were present, and they were patient. And in the research files that Mendel Stromm had left behind in his sudden absence from the company, they were about to find exactly the invitation they had been waiting for. The files that Mendel Stromm had accumulated over the course of their partnership occupied 3 locked cabinets in the private laboratory on Oscorp's 14th floor, cabinets that Norman had always known about and had never, during the years of their collaboration, felt any particular need to open. This was not because he lacked curiosity about Stromm's independent research. Norman lacked curiosity about very little. It was because the partnership, in its functional years, had operated on a kind of implicit mutual respect for territory, an understanding that Stromm's theoretical work was his own until he chose to share it, just as Norman's business decisions were his own until their consequences required discussion. They had built Oscorp on that understanding, among other things, and it had served them well enough that neither of them had seen any reason to disturb it. The cabinets remained locked, and Norman's attention remained directed at the parts of the enterprise that required his more immediate involvement, and for a long time this arrangement produced no particular tension. Mendel Stromm was, in many respects, the kind of scientist that Norman Osborn could never quite be, not because he was more brilliant, though his theoretical gifts were genuine and significant, but because his relationship to the work was fundamentally different in character. Where Norman's scientific interest was always in some part instrumental, oriented toward application and result, and the kind of demonstrable achievement that could be presented to the world as evidence of capability, Stromm followed his curiosity with a purity that was almost childlike, moving from problem to problem according to an internal logic that did not always account for commercial viability or practical application. He was interested in what was possible before he was interested in what was useful, and this quality made him an extraordinary research mind and a somewhat unreliable business partner. Norman had understood this from the beginning and had structured their arrangement accordingly, positioning himself as the external face of Oscorp while Stromm was left largely free to pursue whatever lines of inquiry engaged him, with the understanding that commercially viable results would be shared and developed jointly. The friendship between them, in its genuine phase, had the particular texture of friendships between people who are different enough to find each other interesting, and similar enough to sustain the interest over time. Stromm was warmer than Norman in the ways that were most socially visible, quicker to laugh, more comfortable with the kind of easy personal exchange that Norman always managed somewhat effortfully. He did not find Norman's intensity intimidating, which was itself unusual, and he had a way of responding to Norman's more rigid pronouncements with a mild, affectionate skepticism that Norman found both irritating and oddly welcome. In Stromm's company, Norman was occasionally able to be wrong about something, without it feeling catastrophic, which was an experience rare enough in his life to be genuinely valuable. They disagreed productively about scientific questions and agreed, most of the time, about the direction of the company, and for a number of years this was sufficient foundation for a working relationship that both of them, in their different ways, valued. The deterioration of that relationship was not the result of a single event or a sudden change in either man's character. It was the result of accumulation, of the slow accrual of small decisions and omissions and unspoken resentments that build up in any long partnership and that eventually reach a mass sufficient to alter the fundamental dynamics of the arrangement. Stromm's spending habits had always been somewhat impractical, oriented toward the acquisition of equipment and materials for his research without sufficient attention to the accounting processes through which such acquisitions were supposed to be authorized and documented. In the early years, when Oscorp's finances were tighter and Norman's oversight was more direct, this tendency had been managed through regular conversation and occasional correction. As the company grew and Norman's attention was more broadly distributed, the conversations became less frequent and the corrections less consistent, and Stromm's relationship to the company's financial resources became, gradually and without any dramatic moment of decision, something that the company's auditors would eventually characterize in terms that were difficult to interpret charitably. Norman discovered the irregularities during a quarterly review in the autumn of a year when Oscorp had just secured one of its most significant government contracts, a moment of external success that made the internal discovery feel particularly disorienting. The amounts were not, in the context of Oscorp's overall finances, enormous. They were significant enough to constitute a genuine problem, and they had been recurring over a period of several years, and they had been concealed with a thoroughness that required conscious effort rather than mere carelessness. Norman sat with the auditor's report for a long time before he responded to it, which was characteristic of him. He did not react to significant information until he had considered it from enough angles to understand not just what it meant, but what it meant for him, what it required of him, and what the available responses would each cost. The consideration was thorough, and in its conclusions relatively swift. What Norman felt, in those hours of consideration, was a complicated mixture that he would not have found easy to articulate and did not attempt to. There was anger, genuine and considerable, directed at the betrayal of trust that the irregularities represented, at the discovery that someone he had relied upon and in his way cared for had been taking from the thing they had built together without the honesty to acknowledge it or the respect to ask. There was something underneath the anger that was quieter and more painful, the particular hurt of someone who has always been somewhat braced for betrayal, and who discovers, when it arrives, that being braced for it does not actually reduce its impact. And beneath that, if Norman had been willing to excavate to that depth, which he was not, there was something that resembled relief, the relief of a man who's found a legitimate reason to do something he had perhaps been preparing to do anyway, though he would not have admitted this even to himself. He went to Stromm directly, which was the right thing to do, and which Norman did for reasons that were partly principled and partly practical. A direct confrontation offered control over the terms of the conversation, over what was said and what was not said, over the narrative that would emerge from the encounter. He presented the auditor's findings without accusation or theatre, laying out the documented irregularities with the same precise, unemotional clarity he brought to any business problem, watching Stromm's face as the extent of what Norman knew became apparent. Stromm did not deny it, which Norman had not expected him to. He offered explanations that were partly genuine and partly rationalizations, explanations about research that could not wait for authorization processes, about the conviction that the results would justify the expenditure, about the belief that their partnership had always operated on a level of mutual trust that made formal accounting somewhat beside the point. Norman listened to all of it without interruption, which was a form of courtesy that also served to make clear, without anything being said explicitly, that the explanations were not going to change the outcome. The decision to report Stromm to the relevant authorities rather than to resolve the matter privately was one that Norman presented to himself, and to anyone who subsequently asked, as the only legally and ethically defensible course of action, which in the strict formal sense it was. Oscorp was a company with government contracts and public shareholders, and the discovery of financial irregularities by a senior officer carried obligations that could not simply be set aside for the sake of a personal relationship, regardless of what that relationship had meant or once might have meant. This was all true. It was also true that a private resolution was available, that the amounts involved, while not trivial, were not beyond the capacity of a company of Oscorp's size to absorb and address through internal processes, that other companies in similar situations had chosen paths that did not result in criminal proceedings against a founding partner. Norman was aware of these alternatives and declined them, and the reasons he gave for declining them were legally sufficient and personally convenient in equal measure. Stromm's arrest and subsequent conviction effectively ended his career and removed him from Norman's life with a completeness and finality that a private settlement would not have achieved. Norman told himself that this outcome was the necessary consequence of Stromm's own choices, which was true, and did not examine too carefully the question of whether the necessity had been as absolute as he had presented it, or whether some part of him had chosen the more total resolution, because total resolutions were what Norman Osborn preferred when resolution was required. The professional distance between them had been growing for some time before the discovery of the irregularities, the natural result of the company's expansion, and the increasing complexity of Norman's external responsibilities. It is possible, though not certain, that the friendship would have found its own diminishment eventually through simpler means. What the embezzlement provided was a reason that required no grief, a conclusion that carried the clarity of moral justification rather than the messiness of two people simply growing apart. Norman found moral justification considerably easier to live with than messiness. The research files in the 3 locked cabinets came into Norman's possession in the immediate aftermath of Stromm's departure from Oscorp, as part of the inventory of company assets that the situation required him to document and secure. He had a locksmith open the cabinets in the presence of his legal team and had the contents catalogued with the same thoroughness he brought to any acquisition. Most of what the cabinets contained was exactly what he had expected. The accumulated documentation of Stromm's theoretical research over the course of their partnership, notebooks and printouts, and hand-annotated papers covering a range of chemical and biological questions that Stromm had pursued with varying degrees of sustained attention. Norman reviewed the inventory without particular urgency, setting aside the materials that had obvious relevance to Oscorp's ongoing research programs and delegating the remainder to the appropriate department heads for assessment. It was during his own review of the inventory summary that a particular designation caught his attention and held it. Among the personal research files there was a project that Stromm had been working on for at least 3 years, documented in 4 notebooks and a substantial collection of supporting materials which the cataloguing team had labelled simply as performance enhancement compound, experimental. The description was brief and the categorization unremarkable, the kind of thing that a cataloguing team moving quickly through a large volume of material would note and pass on without particular comment. Norman read the description twice, then set the inventory aside and retrieved the notebooks himself. What Stromm had been working on, in the hours and evenings and weekends that he had not accounted for to his partner or to the company, was a chemical formula aimed at the enhancement of human cognitive and physical performance through a targeted intervention in the body's endocrine and neurological systems. The theoretical basis was sophisticated and, Norman recognized immediately, genuinely original, drawing on a synthesis of research from several different disciplines in a way that reflected Stromm's particular gift for moving across boundaries that more specialized scientists tended to respect. The early experimental results, conducted on animal subjects, were preliminary and in places inconsistent, but they were sufficiently promising to make clear that Stromm had not been pursuing a fantasy. He had been pursuing something real, something that, in the right hands, with the right resources and the right degree of focused development, might be made to work. Norman read through all 4 notebooks over the course of a single night, sitting at his desk in the emptied office with the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Manhattan spread out below him in the darkness. He read with the focused attention of a scientist encountering work that genuinely engages him, making notes in the margins of the inventory copy, flagging passages that raised questions, following Stromm's reasoning through the places where it was elegant and through the places where it was incomplete or unsupported. By the time the sky outside began to lighten, he had formed a clear picture of what Stromm had found, what he had not yet found, and what would be required to move the research from its current state to something that could be tested, and then refined, and then, if the results supported it, applied. He locked the notebooks in his own desk and told no one about them. This decision, made in the early morning hours with the coffee cooling beside him and the first light arriving across the Hudson, was perhaps the most consequential of his life, though it did not feel momentous at the time. It felt practical. The research had been conducted on company time, with company resources, by a man who had forfeited his rights to it through his own conduct. Norman's claim to the material was legally defensible and professionally reasonable, and he did not spend long examining the question of whether Stromm might have seen it differently, or what it would have meant to Stromm to have this particular work, the work he had kept private and pursued on his own terms, absorbed quietly into the company that was no longer his. Norman had learned long ago that the most effective way to proceed was to identify the course of action that was legally and practically supportable, and to proceed along it without excessive examination of the feelings it might produce in other people. He was very good at this. He had been practicing it since childhood. The formula waited in his desk drawer through the months that followed, patient and potential, while Norman attended to the business of running a growing company and managed the public and private dimensions of Stromm's departure. He returned to the notebooks regularly, not yet with any intention of pursuing the research himself, or so he told himself, but simply to think, to follow the theoretical threads that Stromm had left incomplete, to consider what the next stages of development would look like if someone were to pursue them. The thinking was, inevitably, a form of beginning. Norman Osborn had never in his life been able to think about a problem with genuine engagement, and then simply set it aside. The formula was a problem of exactly the kind his mind found most compelling, scientifically intricate, practically significant, and oriented toward a result that spoke directly to the deepest questions he had been asking since childhood. Questions about power and capability, and what a person might become if the limitations that circumstance had imposed could be removed or transcended. He told himself he was simply thinking. The notebooks grew worn at the edges from handling. The margin notes accumulated, and in a private laboratory on the 14th floor, quietly and without announcement, Norman Osborn began to prepare. There is a particular quality to success at its height that is difficult to describe from the outside and difficult to fully inhabit from within. It has something to do with the way that achievement, once reached, immediately reconfigures itself as a baseline rather than a destination, so that the view from the summit turns out to be not a resting place but simply a new vantage point from which further summits become visible. Norman Osborn understood this quality better than most, because he had been climbing long enough to recognize the pattern, and because the part of him that had been formed in that childhood house was constitutionally incapable of mistaking arrival for completion. And yet the years in which Oscorp stood at the height of its influence, and Norman at the height of his public reputation, were years that deserved to be looked at carefully and with some generosity, because they contained real things alongside the restlessness, genuine achievements and genuine moments of something that, if it was not quite contentment, at least resembled it from a certain angle in a certain light. Oscorp's headquarters in those years occupied the upper 12 floors of its midtown tower and a secondary campus in the outer boroughs, where the larger manufacturing operations were housed. The main building was the face the company presented to the world, and it was a face that had been composed with considerable attention to the impression it created. The lobby was designed to communicate stability and forward movement simultaneously, its clean lines and carefully chosen materials suggesting an organization that respected tradition, while remaining oriented toward what came next. The reception staff were trained to be efficient and personable in equal measure. The elevators moved quietly. The corridors on the executive floors were wide enough to feel unhurried, and the laboratories that occupied the upper levels were equipped with the kind of instrumentation that represented the current frontier of what was technically possible. Replaced and upgraded on a schedule that Norman reviewed personally and approved with the particular satisfaction of someone who understands what good equipment means to serious scientific work. The company employed in those peak years somewhere between 800 and 1,000 people across its various operations, a number that Norman knew precisely at any given moment, and that he tracked not as an abstraction, but as a concrete measure of the scale of what he had built. He was not, in the conventional sense, a warm employer, but he was a serious one, and the distinction mattered to the people who worked for him. He expected excellence and was willing to provide the resources that excellence required. He did not tolerate laziness or imprecision, but he also did not punish honest failure when it came from genuine effort, and was accompanied by the kind of clear-eyed analysis that made future success more likely. The scientists who thrived at Oscorp were those who could meet Norman's standards without losing their own sense of direction, who could work within the structure he imposed while retaining the initiative that made their work valuable. It was not an easy balance to maintain, and not everyone managed it, but those who did tended to stay for a long time and to produce work that justified the difficulty of the environment. The government contracts that had formed the backbone of Oscorp's early financial stability had expanded by this period into a web of relationships with defense agencies, research institutions, and regulatory bodies that gave the company a kind of institutional presence in the landscape of American science and industry that went beyond what its size alone would have produced. Norman managed these relationships with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, understanding that the value of such connections lay not in any individual contract, but in the accumulated weight of consistent reliability, of being the kind of organization that government agencies and institutional partners could count on to deliver what it promised on the timeline it specified. He appeared before congressional committees when invited, provided testimony that was always technically precise and politically deft, and cultivated the kind of long-term relationships with influential figures in Washington and Albany that do not make the newspapers, but that shape the conditions in which business is conducted more reliably than any single transaction. The charitable and civic activities that occupied a portion of Norman's public schedule during these years were not, as was sometimes assumed by people who did not know him well, entirely performative. The Osborn Foundation, established in Emily's memory in the years following her death, funded genuine research in areas that Norman cared about independently of their public relations value, including cancer research, educational programs in underserved communities, and scholarships for promising students in the sciences whose families lacked the resources to support them through advanced study. Norman reviewed the Foundation's grant decisions personally, with a level of engagement that went beyond what was strictly necessary for someone in his position, and his choices reflected a real set of priorities rather than simply the preferences of whoever managed the Foundation's communications. There was, in this work, a thread of the person he might have been more consistently if the other pressures of his life had been differently arranged, a person capable of genuine generosity and genuine interest in the development of people who reminded him of his younger self. The public figure that New York knew in these years was a man who occupied his prominence with a certain gravity that the city found reassuring. He was not given to the kind of extravagant display that characterized some of his peers in the business world, did not collect yachts or maintain multiple residences in fashionable locations, or conduct his personal life in ways that attracted the kind of attention he found undignified. The Osborn mansion on Fifth Avenue, purchased when Harry was in his early teens, was large and well appointed, but furnished with a restraint that reflected Norman's taste rather than his budget. He entertained when entertaining served a purpose, hosted the right dinners for the right people, appeared at the right events in the right company, and maintained the overall impression of a man who had achieved significant things and wore that achievement without excessive fuss. People who met him for the first time often commented afterward on his intelligence, on the quality of attention he brought to conversations, on the way he made the person he was speaking with feel, at least for the duration of the exchange, that what they were saying was genuinely interesting to him. This quality was partly cultivated and partly real, and the mixture varied depending on circumstances in ways that Norman managed without obvious effort. Harry, navigating his teenage years within this landscape of public success and private distance, had developed by this period a coping strategy that served him adequately if not well, which was to externalize his father's world rather than trying to inhabit it. He understood, with the clarity that adolescents often develop about the emotional realities their parents would prefer to keep opaque, that Oscorp and everything connected to it occupied a portion of his father's attention and emotional energy that left a residue rather than a remainder for everything else. He did not blame his father for this, or not primarily. He had arrived, through the long patient education of experience, at something like acceptance, a recognition that Norman's limitations as a parent were structural rather than personal, rooted in something that had formed long before Harry arrived, and that Harry's presence had not been sufficient to dismantle. This acceptance was not entirely healthy, and was not accompanied by the kind of processed grief that might have made it genuinely freeing, but it was functional, and Harry was, in those years, managing. What Harry wanted from his father was simpler than Norman could apparently provide, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of ache. He wanted to be known, in the way that children want to be known by the people who are supposed to know them best, not assessed or evaluated or measured against a standard, but simply seen in the particular and irreducible way that one person sees another when they are paying the kind of attention that does not require anything in return. He looked for evidence of this seeing in the small interactions of daily life, in whether his father remembered what he had mentioned wanting, in whether Norman asked about his friends by name, in whether a conversation about Harry's own interests could sustain itself for more than a few minutes before finding its way back to Oscorp or to some principle about how the world worked that Norman wanted to impart. The evidence was inconsistent, and Harry had learned not to build too much on any single instance of it, either of presence or of absence. The dinner table at the Osborn mansion was, during these years, a place where the distance between father and son was most measurable and most quietly painful, not because the dinners were cold or hostile, but because they were conducted with a kind of formal competence that substituted for the warmer and less structured exchange that neither of them quite knew how to initiate. Norman asked about school with genuine interest in the academic dimensions, and a somewhat thinner interest in everything else. He offered opinions and assessments with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his assessments carry weight, and if those opinions sometimes felt to Harry less like conversation than like briefing, Harry had learned to receive them without the kind of visible resistance that would produce a different and more difficult kind of attention. They were not unhappy dinners, exactly. They were dinners at which two people who cared about each other were separated by a glass partition that neither of them had the tools to remove. It was through Harry, in the way that the most significant arrivals often occur, through a side door rather than the main entrance, that the world of Peter Parker first became adjacent to the world of Norman Osborn. Peter's friendship with Harry, which developed during their high school years and deepened during their time at Empire State University, brought him into the Osborn orbit with the gradual, unremarkable naturalness of two social circles that overlap at a single point and then slowly expand their intersection. Norman was aware of Peter in the way that parents are aware of their children's friends, as a figure in the background of Harry's life whose presence was noted without being particularly examined. He knew that the boy was academically gifted, that he was studying science, that he worked as a photographer for the Daily Bugle in circumstances that suggested financial pressures considerably greater than those that characterized Harry's own situation. This much he had absorbed without effort, in the peripheral way that a man of Norman's observational capacity absorbs information about his immediate environment, whether he intends to or not. What Norman made of Peter, in those early encounters at the mansion or at university events where their paths briefly crossed, was something more considered than mere peripheral awareness, though he would not have described his interest in those terms. There was something about the young man that caught his attention in a way that the friends of his sons generally did not, a quality of intelligence that expressed itself not in the performance of intelligence, but in the particular way Peter moved through problems, the directness of his engagement with ideas, the absence of the social calculation that Norman noticed in most people, and that he himself had long since raised to an art form. Peter Parker seemed, in the moments when Norman observed him with any attention, to be entirely focused on whatever was in front of him, without the divided awareness that characterized most of the interactions Norman witnessed, as though the management of impression was simply not a priority he had allocated resources to. Norman found this quality simultaneously admirable and faintly incomprehensible. He did not think about Peter very much, or very often, in those years. There was no reason to. The boy was Harry's friend, a peripheral figure in a domestic context that Norman himself only partially inhabited. The laboratory on the 14th floor was where his real attention lived during this period, in the evenings and on the weekends when the building was quiet and the official business of the day had been concluded, and he could move through the corridors with the particular freedom of a man alone in a space that is entirely his own. The notebooks were there, and the equipment he had quietly accumulated over the preceding months, and the set of problems that Stromm's incomplete research had left waiting for someone with sufficient intelligence and sufficient drive to carry them forward. The formula was not yet close to ready, but it was closer than it had been, and each session in the laboratory produced incremental progress of the kind that Norman found more genuinely satisfying than almost anything that happened in the executive floors above. The restlessness that had always characterized his relationship to achievement was present during these years, but differently textured than it had been before, less like dissatisfaction and more like anticipation, the particular quality of attention that comes when a goal is genuinely within reach, and the remaining distance is a matter of sustained effort rather than uncertain possibility. Oscorp was at its height, and Norman was at his, and the formula was progressing, and somewhere in the future that he was always already inhabiting in his imagination, there was a version of himself that was more than what he currently was, that had transcended the limitations that chemistry and circumstance had imposed, that had become something the frightened boy in the ill-fitting clothes could never have imagined. He held this image of himself with a care that he gave to very little else, tending it in the quiet laboratory hours the way that gardeners tend things that are not yet ready for the light. It was his most private possession and his most dangerous one, and in the fluorescent calm of the 14th floor, surrounded by equipment and notebooks and the patient logic of chemical equations, he did not yet know the difference. The laboratory on the 14th floor had a different quality at night than it did during the working day, and Norman had come to prefer the night version almost exclusively. During business hours, the space functioned as an official Oscorp research facility, staffed by 2 junior chemists whose work Norman had selected with care precisely because it was adjacent to, but not overlapping with what he was doing in the hours when they were gone. They were good scientists, both of them, diligent and precise, and they asked the kind of focused questions that good scientists ask, which meant they did not ask the other kind. When they left in the evenings, gathering their things with the slightly relieved energy of people transitioning from work to the rest of their lives, Norman would remain at his desk until he heard the elevator arrive and depart, and then he would move through the connecting door into the private section of the laboratory that he had arranged gradually and without announcement to be his alone. The private section was not large. It occupied perhaps a quarter of the floor's total laboratory space, separated from the main area by a partition wall that had been installed during a renovation several years earlier, under the description of additional secure storage, which was accurate as far as it went. The equipment it contained had been acquired over a period of 18 months through a combination of legitimate Oscorp procurement channels and more discreet arrangements that did not appear in the company's standard inventory. Norman was not careless about this. He was, in fact, extremely careful in the way that someone is careful when they understand precisely what the exposure of their activities would cost and have made a considered decision that the work is worth that risk. The procurement records that did exist were technically defensible, categorized under research headings that were real, if somewhat broadly defined. The records that did not exist had been made not to exist with the same methodical attention that Norman brought to everything he wanted to control. Stromm's formula, as Norman had inherited it, was a theoretical framework supported by preliminary experimental data of uneven quality. Stromm had been a brilliant theorist, who approached experimental work with an enthusiasm that was not always matched by rigour, and the notebooks reflected this, containing stretches of genuinely elegant reasoning alongside experimental protocols that had been inadequately controlled and results that had been recorded with a looseness that made them difficult to interpret with confidence. Norman had spent the first several months of his private work not attempting to advance the formula, but simply reconstructing it, going back through Stromm's reasoning at every stage and either confirming its validity through his own analysis, or identifying the places where the logic was unsupported and needed to be rebuilt on firmer ground. It was painstaking work, and it was the kind of work that Norman was in some ways better suited to than Stromm had been, because Norman's scientific strengths lay precisely in the systematic and the rigorous, in the construction of frameworks that would bear weight. What Stromm had theorized, and what Norman's reconstruction confirmed as theoretically sound, was a chemical pathway through which the human body's existing performance systems could be dramatically amplified without the kind of cellular damage that had made previous attempts at enhancement compounds unstable or dangerous. The key insight was not brute stimulation of the relevant systems, which produced short-term gains at significant long-term cost, but a more subtle intervention at the regulatory level, a modification of the signaling mechanisms that governed how the body allocated its resources, so that the enhanced state became not an emergency response but a new baseline. The elegance of the concept was genuine. And Norman recognized it as such with the particular respect that one serious scientist feels for another's genuinely original idea. A respect that in this case was complicated by the circumstances of how the idea had come into his possession, but that was no less real for that complication. The animal trials that occupied the middle phase of his private research were conducted with a care and documentation that exceeded what Stromm's preliminary work had achieved, reflecting both Norman's scientific standards and his awareness that he would need to understand exactly what the compound did before he could consider any further application. The subjects were laboratory mice initially, then rats, acquired through standard Oscorp channels as part of the facility's general research supply, and diverted to his private work through the same careful accounting that governed everything else in the 14th-floor operation. The results, emerging over months of patient observation, were broadly consistent with Stromm's theoretical predictions and in some respects more pronounced. The enhanced subjects demonstrated measurable increases in physical performance, in problem-solving speed, in certain indicators of neurological processing that the testing protocols were able to capture, though Norman was careful not to overinterpret results from animal models in ways that outran the actual evidence. There were anomalies in the data that he noted and examined and did not dismiss, because dismissing inconvenient data was not how Norman Osborn did science, whatever else might be said about him. Some of the enhanced subjects exhibited behavioral changes that were not straightforwardly attributable to enhanced performance. Changes in social behavior, in threat response, in the quality of their interactions with other subjects that suggested the compound's effects on neurological systems were broader than the theoretical model had predicted. Norman analysed these anomalies with the same rigour he brought to the confirming data, documented them fully, and incorporated them into his revised understanding of what the compound did. He did not stop the research. He adjusted his model to account for the new information and continued, which was the scientifically correct response, and also the response of someone who has decided, at a level below conscious deliberation, that the destination is worth the complications of the road. The refinement process that followed the animal trial phase occupied the better part of a year, during which Norman worked through a systematic series of modifications to the formula's composition and delivery mechanism, testing each modification against the previous version with a patience that the daylight hours of Oscorp's normal business would not have accommodated. He worked in the specific silence of someone entirely absorbed in a problem that matters to them, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, layered with the ongoing internal conversation of a mind moving through a complex space. The building around him at those hours was almost entirely quiet, the cleaning staff completing their rounds in the lower floors and departing, the security team making their periodic passes through the corridors with a predictability that Norman had mapped without difficulty. He was alone in the way that he was most comfortable being alone, surrounded by the clean logic of the work, insulated from the demands and performances of the world above. By the time the formula had reached what Norman assessed as its most refined and stable version, he had been working on it in private for nearly 3 years. The compound that existed in the carefully labelled storage vessel in his private refrigeration unit was not Stromm's formula any longer in any meaningful sense. It had been rebuilt from the theoretical foundations upward, revised and refined through hundreds of incremental modifications, tested against a body of experimental data that Norman had generated entirely himself. It was his work in every way that scientific work can be said to belong to the person who has shaped it into its final form, and he felt about it the way that scientists sometimes feel about work they have carried for a long time, and brought to a point of genuine completion, with a satisfaction that was quieter and more durable than the louder satisfactions of public achievement, a satisfaction that did not require any audience. What he intended to do with it was a question he had been circling for months, approaching and retreating, examining from different angles without arriving at a conclusion. He was entirely comfortable articulating even to himself. The scientific work was complete, or complete enough to move beyond the laboratory phase, and the logic of that completion pointed in a direction that Norman had been aware of since the early months of his private research, since the evenings when he had first fully grasped what Stromm's theoretical framework was proposing and felt, alongside the intellectual excitement, something more personal and more urgent. The formula was designed to enhance human performance. He was human. The question of whether he would test it on himself was one he had been answering slowly over 3 years of preparation, and the answer, he understood now, had never really been in doubt. The night he chose was a Thursday in late autumn, selected for no reason more significant than that it followed a day on which all of the relevant practical circumstances were correctly arranged. When the building would be quiet and his schedule the following morning was clear enough to allow for whatever recovery time might be needed, and when the particular restlessness that had been building in him over the preceding weeks had reached a pitch that made further waiting feel more costly than the risk of proceeding. He had prepared the injection with the same care he had brought to every other stage of the process, verifying the compound's composition against his most recent analysis, checking the delivery mechanism, reviewing the protocol he had developed for monitoring his own physiological response in the immediate aftermath. He was as prepared as it was possible to be, which is not the same as being prepared for everything, though he did not fully appreciate the distinction at the time. What happened next did not happen according to his protocol. Norman had been in the laboratory for perhaps 40 minutes, had completed his preliminary checks, had been in the process of preparing the final stage of his preparation, when he became aware of something that his protocol had not included and could not have included because it arrived from outside, from the part of the Oscorp enterprise that was not his private laboratory, but was still, in the most consequential sense, connected to it. There was someone else in the building, someone who had not been there when he arrived, someone who had accessed the floor through a route that bypassed the standard security checkpoints in a way that required either significant technical expertise or inside knowledge of the building systems. Norman became aware of this in the particular way that he became aware of most things, through an accumulation of small signals that his continuously running threat assessment registered and processed before his conscious attention had fully caught up. He was moving toward the partition door when the explosion occurred. It was not large, as explosions go, and it was not in his laboratory, but in the main section of the floor, originating from a point near the primary equipment bank where something had been interfered with in a way that Norman would later determine was deliberate. Designed not to destroy the laboratory, but to create a cascade failure in the ventilation and filtration systems that governed the controlled environment of the private section. The partition wall absorbed the initial force of the blast, but what it could not absorb was the pressure differential that followed, which drove the door open with a force that Norman, moving toward it at the moment of the explosion, could not counter. He went down in the connecting corridor, and the storage vessel that he had been carrying, the compound that represented 3 years of careful private work, came open as he fell. The exposure was not instantaneous in its effects, which was almost worse, because the delay allowed him to get up, to assess the situation, to begin the procedures that the circumstances required, to call the security team and initiate the building's emergency protocols, to do all of the functional things that a man in his position was required to do. While the compound that had soaked through his clothing and been absorbed through skin and through the disrupted air of the compromised filtration system was already moving through his system in ways that his 3 years of careful preparation had not been designed to manage from the inside. He knew what the compound did. He had studied its effects with considerable thoroughness. The knowledge did not help in the way that he might have hoped, because knowing what something does to a biological system from the outside is a categorically different kind of knowledge from experiencing what it does from within. The hospitalization that followed lasted 11 days, during which Norman was aware of himself with a discontinuous quality that he found deeply disorienting, present and absent in alternating periods, that the medical staff attributed to the neurological effects of the chemical exposure, and that Norman experienced as something more like a tide, advancing and retreating, each withdrawal leaving the shoreline slightly different from how it had been before. The physical symptoms were manageable and resolved within the first several days. What did not resolve, what the physicians who treated him were not equipped to fully assess, because they did not know what had been in the compound, was the effect on the neurological architecture that Stromm's formula and Norman's 3 years of refinement had targeted. The regulatory mechanisms that governed how Norman's mind allocated its resources, how it calibrated threat and reward and the relationship between impulse and action, had been altered in ways that were subtle enough that no standard diagnostic protocol could identify them clearly, and significant enough that Norman, lying in his hospital bed in the quiet hours of the night, could feel them. He could feel the difference the way that you can feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives, not through any single sensation, but through a general alteration in the quality of everything, a shift in the relationship between the world and his perception of it, that was not dramatic but that was persistent, and that he understood with the scientific clarity that remained available to him even in those altered hours, was not going to resolve itself when the hospital discharged him. Something had changed. He did not yet know the full shape of what had changed, or what it would ask of him, or what it would cost. He lay in the hospital and looked at the ceiling and felt the tide moving in him, and outside the window the city continued its patient business, indifferent and brilliant and entirely unaware of what had happened on the 14th floor of a midtown tower and what that happening had set in motion in the mind of the man who had built it. The changes did not announce themselves dramatically, which was in some ways more unsettling than a dramatic announcement would have been. Norman had expected during the hospital stay and in the careful weeks of recovery that followed that the effects of the compound would declare themselves in ways that were identifiable and therefore manageable, that the scientific understanding he possessed of what the formula was designed to do would give him sufficient forewarning to monitor and contain whatever the accidental exposure had initiated. This expectation was not entirely wrong. He could observe certain changes with the detached precision of a scientist monitoring a subject, could note the enhanced acuity of his perceptions, the increased speed of his cognitive processing, the way that problems he had previously needed to work through sequentially now presented their solutions in a more simultaneous and immediate fashion, as though the distance between question and answer had been compressed. These were the effects the formula had been designed to produce, and their presence confirmed that the compound had done what it was theoretically supposed to do, which ought to have been reassuring and was instead simply strange. Because knowing that something is working as designed does not prepare you for the experience of it working inside you. What Norman had not fully accounted for, in his 3 years of careful preparation and his months of reviewing the animal trial data, was the difference between observing enhanced performance in a subject and being a subject whose performance had been enhanced. The mice and rats in his trials had demonstrated measurable improvements across a range of cognitive and physical indicators, and he had recorded these improvements with scientific satisfaction and moved on to the next stage of analysis. What his data had not captured, because data of that kind cannot capture it, was the subjective experience of existing in a system that has been fundamentally reconfigured, the particular quality of consciousness that belongs to a mind that has been made more powerful without being made more wise. He was thinking faster and more clearly than he had ever thought before, and the contents of that faster, clearer thinking included everything that had always been in his mind, every ambition and resentment and unresolved grievance and suppressed desire, now processed with an efficiency and a vividness that removed the comfortable blur that normal cognitive speed had previously provided. The restlessness that had always characterized his relationship to achievement returned in the weeks following his discharge from the hospital, but it was a different restlessness now. Not the familiar low hum of dissatisfaction seeking its next object, but something more acute and more directional, something that felt less like wanting and more like pressure, as though the accumulated weight of everything he had always wanted and never fully allowed himself to pursue was now being processed by a system powerful enough to take it seriously. He sat in his office at Oscorp and moved through his scheduled obligations with a competence that was, if anything, more impressive than usual, his enhanced cognitive capacity making the ordinary demands of running the company feel almost effortless. And in the space that effortlessness created, he found thoughts arriving that he had previously kept at a more manageable distance. The thoughts were not, in their earliest form, thoughts about crime or violence, or the particular theatrical persona that would eventually give them their expression. They were older and simpler than that. The thoughts of a man who has spent his entire life feeling underestimated by a world that rewarded the wrong qualities and recognized the wrong people, who has constructed an enormously successful public life and still carries, in the quietest part of himself, the conviction that the recognition he has received is insufficient to the actual scale of what he deserves. These thoughts had always been present. What the compound had done was to remove whatever filter had previously kept them from occupying the foreground of his attention, to allow them to present themselves not as the uncomfortable undercurrent they had always been, but as a clear and cogent argument that his enhanced mind was now entirely capable of taking seriously. He noticed, during this period, that his tolerance for the ordinary social performances of his professional life was diminishing. The charity dinners and civic ceremonies that he had previously managed with practiced grace began to feel not merely tedious but genuinely insulting. Exercises in the public celebration of mediocrity that he found increasingly difficult to navigate without a quality of visible contempt that he had to consciously suppress. the conversations he was expected to have with people whose intelligence did not approach his own, which had always required management but had previously been manageable, now required a degree of effort that expressed itself in a tightening around his jaw, and a quality of controlled impatience that several of his closest associates noted with concern and attributed to the stress of his recovery. Norman let them attribute it to stress. It was easier than the alternative. The dreams began approximately 3 weeks after his discharge, and they were unlike the dreams he had previously had, which were the ordinary dreams of a man with an active and pressured professional life. Fragmentary and referential and quickly forgotten. These dreams had a narrative coherence and a sensory vividness that stayed with him through the waking hours, that he found himself returning to involuntarily during meetings and in the margins of his working day. They were dreams of power expressed without restraint, of being seen and acknowledged and feared in equal measure, of moving through the world without the constant management and calibration that his public life required, with a freedom and a force that belonged to something that was not quite human in the ordinary sense of that word. He didn't find these dreams disturbing. This was, in retrospect, the most significant thing about them. The goblin imagery that populated those dreams had its roots in something real, in a specific and traceable element of Norman's personal history that the compound had apparently excavated and brought to the surface with the same indiscriminate thoroughness with which it had amplified everything else. Norman had encountered goblins, in the folkloric and artistic sense, as a young boy in a book that had belonged to his mother, a collection of European folk tales illustrated with the kind of elaborate and slightly unsettling imagery that characterized the better illustrated volumes of that tradition. The goblins in that book were not the simple malevolent creatures of some versions of the folklore. They were tricksters and anarchists, figures who existed outside the social order and who delighted in the exposure of its pretensions, who saw through the performances that respectable society required and found them ridiculous, who had the freedom that comes from having no stake in the existing arrangement and therefore no reason to pretend that it deserved respect. The young Norman had found these figures compelling in a way that he had not had the vocabulary to analyse, but that he had felt clearly, the recognition of something that resonated with a part of his experience that the daylight world did not have room for. The book had been lost in one of the several moves of his childhood, and Norman had not thought about it consciously for decades, had not needed to, because the part of him that had responded to those images had found its expression in more socially acceptable forms, in the competitive intensity of his professional life, in the occasional private satisfaction of a business maneuver that was technically within the rules and comprehensively devastating to its target. But the compound had apparently located that early resonance in whatever part of memory stores the things we respond to before we understand why, and had presented it back to him with the full force of his enhanced imagination. And his enhanced imagination had done what enhanced imaginations do with compelling material. It had elaborated. It had extended. It had built something. The construction of the costume and equipment was not something Norman decided to do in any single moment of deliberate choice. It emerged from the dreams and from the quiet laboratory hours with the organic logic of something that has been preparing itself for a long time, and that finds, in the right conditions, the circumstances required for its expression. He began with sketches made in notebooks that he kept separate from his professional work, that were initially more like the sketches of a costume designer or a theatrical set designer than anything else. Explorations of an aesthetic that combined the goblin imagery of his childhood book with the technological vocabulary of his scientific background. The figure that emerged from these sketches over several weeks of iteration was not realistic in the sense of resembling anything that existed, but it was coherent, possessed of a visual logic that made each element feel necessary rather than arbitrary. The mask was the element he returned to most frequently in the sketches, revising and refining its features through dozens of versions before arriving at something that satisfied him. What he was working toward, without having initially articulated it in these terms, was a face that expressed what his own face had spent a lifetime concealing, the full force of the contempt and the hunger and the absolute confidence in his own superiority that had always been present beneath the composed executive surface. The final design achieved this with a precision that Norman found, when he set it beside his earlier attempts, genuinely impressive. The pointed ears, the wide and slightly asymmetrical eyes, the fixed expression that contained both menace and amusement in a combination that was somehow more disturbing than either quality alone, These were not arbitrary aesthetic choices, but the result of a long and careful process of externalizing something internal, of giving form to what had previously been formless. The glider was an engineering problem of a kind Norman genuinely enjoyed, requiring him to apply his scientific expertise to a set of design constraints that were unusual enough to be interesting. He wanted a platform that was fast and maneuverable, and that presented a particular kind of visual impression in motion that looked purposeful and slightly threatening in the way that the best designed objects look threatening, not through any single feature, but through the overall integration of form and function. He worked through the propulsion problem over several weeks, settling on a solution that used technology derived from research that Oscorp had conducted for a military contract several years earlier, adapted and refined for his specific requirements. The finished device was something that Norman, setting aside everything else, could not help but regard with the objective satisfaction of an engineer who has solved a difficult problem cleanly and elegantly. The weapons followed from the aesthetic logic of the costume and the theatrical sensibility of the overall conception, which required implements that were both genuinely dangerous and visually consistent with the persona they were designed to serve. The pumpkin bombs, arriving at their final form through a design process that was simultaneously playful and lethal, satisfied Norman's sense of theatrical coherence in a way that more conventional weapons would not have. They were serious weapons that did not look entirely serious, and this quality of misdirection, of concealing genuine danger behind an absurd exterior, appealed to something in him that the compound had made newly available and newly insistent. He tested them privately, in circumstances that he controlled with the same care he had brought to every other aspect of the preparation, and their performance confirmed that the playfulness of the design had not come at any cost to their effectiveness. The completed costume hung in his private laboratory for several days before he wore it for the first time, and Norman found himself returning to look at it during this period with a quality of attention that was somewhere between a scientist examining a finished experiment and an artist examining a finished work. It was both of these things, and it was also something that neither of those categories quite captured, something more personal than science and more purposeful than art. The figure the costume represented was not Norman Osborn, or rather, it was not the Norman Osborn that the world knew, that had been constructed through decades of careful management and presented consistently to the audiences that mattered. It was something that had always been present beneath that presentation, something that the compound had not created but had simply freed from the inhibitions and the learned self-restraint that a childhood in that particular house had spent years installing. When he finally put it on, standing in the private laboratory in the small hours of a weekday morning with the city quiet outside and the building empty around him, the experience was not what he would have predicted if he'd been in the habit of predicting his own emotional responses, which he generally was. He had expected something theatrical, a sense of transformation, of becoming a different person. What he felt instead was simpler and in some ways more disturbing than that. He felt, for the first time in as long as he could reliably remember, entirely like himself. Not the managed, calibrated, performing self that occupied the executive floors above. Not the careful scientist who worked in private to avoid scrutiny. Something prior to both of these, something that the frightened boy in the ill-fitting clothes had always been moving toward without knowing what it was. Something that the compound had finally made available, and the costume had finally given form. He stood in the green and purple and the fixed, knowing expression of the mask, and whatever part of him was still capable of genuine, unmediated response, understood that this was not a disguise. It was the face he had always been wearing underneath. The first night out arrived not with fanfare, but with the quiet logic of inevitability, the way that things arrive when they have been prepared for so thoroughly that the moment of beginning feels less like a decision than like the natural completion of a process already well underway. Norman had spent the weeks following the costume's completion in a state of heightened internal activity that expressed itself outwardly as a slightly increased efficiency in his professional obligations and inwardly as something considerably more turbulent, a continuous low-level pressure that the daylight hours and their demands could contain but not dissipate. He moved through his scheduled days with the composed authority that his staff expected and received, attended the meetings that required his presence, reviewed the reports that required his attention, and in the margins of all of this felt the thing that the compound had awakened in him, pressing against the boundaries of the life he'd constructed with a patience that was diminishing by degrees. The criminal underworld of New York City in those years was not a unified or particularly organized entity, which was something that Norman had understood in the abstract as a business matter, as one of the contextual realities of operating a large company in an urban environment where certain kinds of regulatory and legal complexity were simply part of the landscape. He understood it now in a different and more detailed way, having spent a portion of his enhanced cognitive capacity during the preparation period in a thorough analysis of the city's criminal ecosystem, its major figures and their territories, its organizational structures and their vulnerabilities, its existing hierarchies, and the fault lines along which those hierarchies might be disrupted by a sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently resourced new presence. This analysis was not conducted out of any prior experience with criminal enterprise. It was conducted with the same systematic thoroughness that Norman brought to any competitive landscape he intended to enter, because entering a new competitive landscape without understanding its existing dynamics was not something Norman Osborn did. What he had concluded from this analysis was that the existing criminal organizations of New York were led, almost without exception, by people whose success owed more to the accidents of territory and inheritance and the willingness to use violence than to any genuine strategic intelligence. They had built their operations through the accumulation of force and the exploitation of fear, had maintained them through the same means, and were consequently both more powerful than individual law enforcement could easily address, and more brittle than their surface solidity suggested, vulnerable to anyone who understood their actual structure and was capable of operating at a level of sophistication that their leaderships could not match or anticipate. Norman found this assessment simultaneously contemptuous and useful. The contempt was genuine. The usefulness was what he intended to act on. The enforcers were his initial point of contact with this world, chosen not because they were the most significant criminal organization available, but because they were, at the relevant moment, the most practically useful. A group of professional criminals whose particular skills and existing operational footprint made them suitable instruments for the kind of initial establishment of presence that Norman had in mind. Montana, Fancy Dan, and Ox were not, individually or collectively, the kind of people that Norman Osborn would have acknowledged in his professional life, and the meetings he conducted with them in the early weeks of the Green Goblin's existence were exercises in a kind of calculated social translation, presenting himself and his intentions in terms that these particular interlocutors could evaluate and respond to without requiring them to understand anything about the strategic vision that lay behind the immediate proposal. He was, in this respect, the same person he had always been, managing his presentation for his audience, adjusting the register without compromising the substance. The arrangement he proposed was straightforward in its structure if unusual in its terms. The enforcers would provide operational muscle and existing criminal infrastructure for a series of activities that Norman had selected and planned. In return, they would receive a share of the proceeds and the protection that came from operating under the direction of someone whose intelligence and resources significantly exceeded their own. What they would not receive, and what Norman made clear in terms that were entirely comprehensible to people of their professional background, was any meaningful insight into who he was or what his larger intentions were. The Goblin was a persona, a figure, a force, and the enforcers were tools that the figure intended to use. The distinction was not subtle, and it was not intended to be. The first criminal activities conducted under the Green Goblin's direction were selected with an attention to strategic purpose that distinguished them fundamentally from the opportunistic operations that characterized most of the criminal activity in Norman's analysis. He was not interested in robbery for its own sake or in the accumulation of money beyond what the establishment of his position required. What he was interested in was the demonstration of capability and the communication of a particular kind of message to the existing powers of the criminal world, a message that could be summarized in terms that those powers would understand as the announcement that something new had arrived and that the existing arrangements of dominance and territory were no longer as fixed as their current occupants believed. The operations he designed were therefore chosen as much for their communicative value as for their practical yield, selected to be visible in the right ways to the right audiences, to create a pattern of evidence that the criminal world could read and interpret correctly. The theatrical quality that characterized everything the Green Goblin did from the beginning was not accidental or incidental to the criminal enterprise. It was central to it, as central as the planning and the execution, because Norman understood, with the clarity of a mind that had spent decades thinking about how power is communicated and maintained, that fear is a more durable instrument of control than force alone, and that fear of a particular and productive kind requires the cultivation of a particular kind of impression. The pumpkin bombs announced arrival before the glider was visible. The glider's appearance confirmed what the bombs had promised. The mask's fixed expression, encountered in the aftermath of both, communicated what words would have been insufficient to convey, which was the absolute confidence of someone who has nothing to prove and everything to enjoy about what they have just demonstrated. This sequence refined through the first several operations into something that Norman privately regarded as having the internal logic of a well-designed experiment, produced the response he had intended. Word moved through the criminal underworld with the particular speed that significant information moves in environments where information is both valuable and dangerous. The Green Goblin was discussed in the kinds of conversations that took place in the back rooms of certain establishments, and in the careful phrasing of communications between people who understood that what they said might be heard by people they had not invited to listen. The discussions were not uniformly respectful, because the criminal world's initial response to any new presence is assessment rather than deference, and assessment requires the examination of weakness alongside strength. But they were serious, which was what Norman required them to be. The figure that the city's criminal elements were beginning to construct in their collective imagination was coherent with the figure he had intended to project, something intelligent and unpredictable, and possessed of a quality of detachment from normal human concerns that made it more rather than less threatening, because threats from people who want something recognizable can be negotiated with, while threats from people whose motivations are not entirely legible cannot. Spider-Man's first awareness of the Green Goblin came through the same channels that Spider-Man's awareness of most things came through, the combination of his own patrol activity and the accumulated intelligence that filtered up from street-level contacts and police radio and the general informational ecosystem of a city where a masked hero had been operating long enough to have developed a working familiarity with the patterns of criminal activity and their disruptions. What reached Peter Parker's attention in those early weeks was not yet a clear picture, but a set of fragments. Reports of criminal activity with an unusual signature, a theatrical quality, and a level of planning that distinguished it from the ordinary business of the city's underworld. The name that was beginning to attach itself to these fragments in the conversations Peter was able to access, the Green Goblin, was new enough to be unattached to any existing profile, which made it both interesting and, to the part of Peter's mind that had learned through experience to take new and unknown quantities seriously, somewhat concerning. The first direct encounter between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin was arranged, on Norman's side, with more deliberate intention than Spider-Man knew. Norman had, by this point, developed a considerable interest in the wall-crawler that was distinct from his interest in the criminal operations he was conducting, though the two interests had begun to converge in his thinking in ways that would become increasingly significant. He had observed Spider-Man from a distance during his analytical phase, had studied the hero's public appearances and the accounts of his various confrontations with the criminals who had previously occupied Norman's attention, and had formed an assessment that combined genuine respect for Spider-Man's capabilities with the particular quality of competitive interest that Norman reserved for things he had determined were worthy of his serious attention. Spider-Man was the most capable obstacle that the Green Goblin's operations were likely to encounter, and encountering him in circumstances of Norman's own design was considerably preferable to encountering him in circumstances that were not. The encounter, when it came, had the quality of a first meeting between people who have heard a great deal about each other and are discovering that the reality is both consistent with and different from the account. Spider-Man found the Green Goblin to be exactly as physically capable as the preliminary evidence had suggested, and considerably more psychologically unusual than most of the opponents he had faced. Someone whose behavior during combat did not conform to the patterns that Peter had learned to read and anticipate, who seemed to be operating according to an internal logic that Peter could not immediately decode. The Goblin's willingness to disengage and withdraw, at a moment of his own choosing, before any clear outcome had been reached was particularly disorienting, because it communicated that the encounter had served some purpose, Norman intended it to serve rather than representing a defeat or an escape. And Spider-Man was left with the uncomfortable sense of having participated in something whose significance he did not fully understand. Norman, returning to the private laboratory in the small hours of the morning following the encounter, reviewed the experience with the analytical attention he brought to any significant event. Spider-Man was everything his preliminary assessment had suggested, and somewhat more interesting in direct engagement than even that assessment had indicated. The hero's physical capabilities were impressive in ways that the public record had not fully captured, his reflexes and spatial intelligence in combat genuinely exceptional, his adaptation to unexpected developments in the moment faster than Norman had observed in any other opponent. These were qualities that Norman noted with the scientific precision of someone categorizing the properties of a compound, and alongside the notation he felt something else, something that the compound had made considerably more accessible than it had previously been, a quality of excited recognition, of encountering something that was genuinely worthy of what he had become. The criminal operations continued through the weeks that followed with an efficiency that the enforcers found satisfying, and that Norman found increasingly peripheral to his real interest, which had shifted with the completeness of a mind that reorganizes its priorities around a new and more compelling problem. Toward the question of Spider-Man. The Goblin's relationship to the underworld had served its initial purpose, establishing a presence and a reputation sufficient to provide operational resources and a certain kind of visibility. But the underworld itself was not, Norman had concluded, the appropriate arena for what the Green Goblin actually represented. The criminals who populated it were instruments and context rather than genuine competition, and genuine competition was what Norman's enhanced mind had identified as the thing it most required. Not the management of forces weaker than itself, which was simply administration by another name, but the engagement with something that could actually test what had been built, that could provide the particular quality of opposition that makes the exercise of power meaningful rather than merely efficient. The theatrical dimension of the Green Goblin's activities acquired during this period a new and more specific orientation, directed increasingly toward the hero who had become Norman's primary interest, rather than toward the criminal audiences for whom the earlier performances had been designed. The bombs and the glider and the mask had been developed as instruments of a general impression, of a presence that the world would register and respond to in the ways Norman intended. They were becoming something more particular now, elements of a communication directed at a single recipient, a language being developed for a specific conversation that Norman was in the process of deciding how to begin. The city moved below the glider on his nightly circuits, bright and complicated and entirely unaware of the nature of what was moving above it, and Norman looked down at it with the fixed expression of the mask and felt the pressure of the compound and the accumulated weight of everything he had always been building toward, and understood with the clarity of a mind that has finally arrived at the problem it was always designed for, that whatever came next, whatever the full expression of what he had become would eventually require, it would involve Spider-Man at its center, because Spider-Man was the only thing in this city that was genuinely worth the attention of the Green Goblin. And the Green Goblin intended to give it everything it had. The city that the Green Goblin surveyed from above on those nightly circuits was the same city that Peter Parker moved through at street level every day, and the distance between those two perspectives, one elevated and calculating and increasingly singular in its focus, the other grounded and relational and embedded in the ordinary textures of daily life, was one of the defining ironies of the period that preceded their full collision. Norman Osborn and Peter Parker occupied adjacent territories in almost every meaningful sense. The same social world through Harry, the same city, the same broad landscape of scientific interest, and yet the nature of what each of them was and what each of them was becoming meant that their proximity was simultaneously intimate and entirely opaque. Two people close enough to touch who could not yet see each other clearly because the most important things about both of them were hidden. One by choice and one by necessity from everyone around them. Harry Osborn was the point at which their worlds made contact, the human intersection of two lives that would otherwise have had no particular reason to converge, and Harry's position at that intersection was one he occupied with a warmth and an openness that was characteristic of him, and that neither Norman nor Peter fully appreciated for what it was, which was the expression of someone whose capacity for genuine connection had survived somewhat miraculously the conditions under which it had been required to develop. Harry wanted people around him, wanted the texture of friendship and shared experience, wanted to be known by the people he cared about and to know them in return. And this wanting was not need in the diminished sense, but something more active and more generous, the reaching out of someone who had received less than he required and had responded by deciding to give more rather than less. It was one of the better things about Harry Osborn, and it was something that both his father and his best friend found simultaneously touching, and, in different ways, difficult to fully receive. The friendship between Harry and Peter had its origins in the particular social chemistry of university life, in the way that people find each other during the first weeks of a new environment, when the usual social categories have been temporarily suspended and genuine affinity can surface before the reconstructed hierarchies have had time to reassert themselves. Harry had approached Peter with the directness that was natural to him, drawn by the quality of intelligence he recognised in Peter's contributions to their shared classes, and by the absence of the particular kind of social calculation that he had been surrounded by for most of his life. The calculation that attached itself to the Osborn name, and that made it genuinely difficult to know whether the people who sought his company were seeking him or seeking what came with him. Peter was manifestly uninterested in what came with the Osborn name. He was interested, when he was interested, in Harry himself, in the conversation and the company, and this quality of interest was something Harry recognised and valued immediately. Peter's experience of Harry was similarly uncomplicated in its foundation, if somewhat complicated in its details. He liked Harry with the directness that his more guarded approach to most social connections did not usually permit, liked the warmth and the generosity, and the way that Harry's humour had a quality of self-awareness that prevented it from sliding into the cruelty that characterised the humour of some people in their social world. Harry was not Flash Thompson, was not the kind of person who used other people as material, and Peter's relief at this discovery was not something he examined too carefully. But that was real, and that shaped the way he invested in the friendship from its earlier stages. He was aware, in the background of their relationship, of the weight that Harry carried in connection with his father, the particular quality of wistfulness that appeared in Harry's expression when Norman was mentioned, and that Peter, with his own history of loss and complicated love, recognised and did not press. Norman's presence in Harry's life during this period was experienced by Harry as a kind of atmospheric condition rather than a consistent personal reality, something whose effects were felt continuously even when the thing itself was not directly present. He could gauge his father's engagement with the family's domestic life by small indices that he had developed over years of careful observation, the frequency and duration of the dinners Norman actually attended, the quality of attention he brought to conversations, the degree to which what Harry said seemed to register as something Norman was actually receiving rather than simply processing and filing. During the years of Harry's university education, these indices suggested that Norman was more than usually absorbed in whatever was occupying his private attention, arriving at the family dinner table with a quality of barely contained energy that Harry found both familiar and slightly different from its previous manifestations, as though the restlessness that had always been present in his father had found a new and more specific orientation. Harry did not mention these observations to Peter, not because he was concealing them, but because they belonged to the private internal accounting that he maintained regarding his father, an accounting that was not something he had developed the language to share even with the people he most trusted. He mentioned Norman in the way that people mention the central facts of their lives, in passing and without elaboration, in references that acknowledged his father's existence and his prominence and the complicated emotional weather of their relationship without attempting to explain or analyse any of it. Peter received these references with the tact of someone who understood, from his own experience, that some things about the people who formed us are not available for casual discussion, and their friendship was richer for this mutual recognition. What Harry most wanted from his father, and what Norman was least equipped to provide, had not changed substantially from what it had always been. The university years brought Harry new contexts and new relationships, and a growing sense of his own identity that owed more to his friendships and his emerging adult personality than to anything his father had deliberately cultivated. And this independent development was both a source of pride for Norman, expressed in the distant and slightly formal way that Norman expressed most things, and an occasion for the particular guilt that surfaces in parents who recognise, too late or too intermittently, that their child has been building a self largely without them, Norman noticed Harry's growth with the attention of someone observing a significant development in a domain they have been insufficiently present in, and what he felt about what he noticed was a mixture that included genuine admiration, alongside the complicated grief of partial absence, the particular sorrow of a parent who can see what he has missed, but cannot easily find his way back to what he has been missing from. Their dinners together, conducted with a regularity that represented genuine effort on Norman's part and genuine hope on Harry's, had a quality that fluctuated according to the conditions that neither of them entirely controlled. The good dinners, when they occurred, had something real in them, moments when the glass partition that separated father and son became briefly permeable, and something warmer and more direct passed between them. Norman, on these occasions, was capable of a quality of attention that was not merely evaluative but genuinely curious, interested in Harry as a person rather than as a project, and Harry received this attention with a warmth that was somewhat heartbreaking in its transparency, the warmth of someone who's been waiting for exactly this, and is aware, even in the receiving of it, that it may not last. The other dinners, more frequent, were the dinners of two people managing their relationship with competence and goodwill and insufficient ease, conversations that were perfectly adequate and that left Harry driving back to his apartment afterward with the familiar mild ache of something almost reached and not quite. Peter's encounters with Norman during this period were infrequent and characterized by a quality of mutual assessment that was not entirely comfortable for either party, though they would have described their discomfort differently. Peter was aware of Norman primarily through Harry's relationship with him, through the way Norman's presence or absence shaped Harry's emotional weather, and this awareness predisposed him to a mild protective wariness on his friend's behalf that expressed itself not in any overt hostility, but in a quality of reserve that was somewhat unusual for Peter. In social situations he was not actively managing for other reasons. He observed Norman with the attentiveness of someone who has learned to read people accurately, and who is reading something in this particular person that he cannot entirely categorize, a quality of intelligence and control that was familiar in its components, but unusual in its combination and its intensity. Norman's observations of Peter, conducted with the enhanced perceptual capacity that the compound had provided, were more detailed and more considered than Peter would have suspected. He noticed the intelligence first, as he had noticed it in their earliest brief encounters, but he noticed it now with the fuller attention of a mind that had been significantly upgraded since those encounters, and that found Peter's particular quality of cognitive engagement more interesting rather than less, the more carefully he examined it. There was something about the way Peter Parker engaged with problems, a directness and a quality of unself-conscious absorption that Norman recognized as belonging to the genuinely gifted rather than merely the accomplished, the mark of someone for whom thinking is not a performance, but a primary mode of being in the world. He recognized it because it was something he had always found in himself, or had found in himself before the compound, and the transformation had made everything so much louder and so much less private. He noticed other things about Peter as well. Things that a less observant or less systematically attentive person might have missed. He noticed the way Peter moved, which was unusual in ways that could be attributed to athletic conditioning, but that had a quality of spatial awareness and controlled precision that went somewhat beyond what that explanation fully accounted for. He noticed the frequency and pattern of Peter's absences from the social context they shared through Harry, absences that had a particular signature of sudden departure, an unconvincing excuse that Norman's professional experience in assessing the reliability of explanations found somewhat thin. He noticed the camera that Peter carried with such consistent purpose, and the photographs of Spider-Man that were appearing with notable frequency in the Daily Bugle, and the fact that the quality and angle of these photographs suggested an intimacy with the subject that the official explanation of freelance news photography did not entirely account for. These observations did not, during this period, cohere into a conclusion. They accumulated in the part of Norman's mind that filed unresolved patterns, stored with the patient organization of a system that does not discard potentially useful information simply because its utility is not yet apparent. Norman was not, at this stage of the Goblin's development, in the business of investigating Spider-Man's identity in any systematic or purposeful way. His interest in Spider-Man was real and growing, but it was the interest of someone identifying a worthy opponent and developing an understanding of that opponent's capabilities, rather than the interest of someone who has decided to strip away the opponent's protection. That determination would come later, under different circumstances and from a different configuration of motivation. For now, the observations simply accumulated, and Peter Parker remained, in Norman's conscious assessment, his son's interesting friend, the quiet photographer with the good mind and the slightly unexplained absences. The social occasions that brought all of them together in the same room were infrequent enough to be somewhat charged with the weight of their infrequency, the particular heightened quality that gatherings have when the people attending them do not see each other often enough for the event to feel routine. Harry orchestrated these occasions with the enthusiastic investment of someone who places high value on bringing the people he loves into the same space, who believes, with the optimism that characterized his best self, that proximity and shared food and the ordinary magic of social warmth can bridge whatever distances exist between people. He was sometimes right about this and sometimes not, and the evenings in question tended to be both at once, genuinely warm in their social texture and faintly underlaid with the knowledge of all the things that the people present were not saying to each other. Peter at these gatherings was operating on multiple levels simultaneously, as he always was in any situation that required the management of his secret identity alongside the management of ordinary social interaction, present and engaged and also perpetually monitoring the internal signals that might require sudden departure and the careful calculation of how to explain that departure plausibly. He liked being in Harry's company under almost any circumstances, and he was capable, in the better moments of these evenings, of setting down enough of the management to simply be present in the way that his friendship with Harry deserved. When he looked at Norman across these gatherings, he felt the mild protective wariness that had been part of his relationship to Harry's father since the beginning, and occasionally, in the moments when he caught Norman looking back with the quality of attention that was somewhat unusual in its focus, something that was not quite unease but was in that neighbourhood. Norman at these gatherings was performing the role of present and engaged father, with the competence that he brought to all performances, and the performance was not entirely a performance, because the part of him that loved Harry and wished the distance between them was smaller was genuinely present at these occasions, genuinely trying, in the limited and somewhat graceless way that he tried most personal things, to be more than the atmospheric condition that Harry experienced him as. The compound was always present in the background of these efforts, its effects not dramatic enough in ordinary social context to be visible, but present in the quality of attention Norman brought to everything, in the enhanced speed with which he processed the room and its contents, in the way that what ought to have been a pleasant family dinner also felt, from the inside of Norman's enhanced perception, like a space full of information that his mind was filing and categorizing with an efficiency that did not stop simply because the occasion called for something simpler and warmer. The city outside continued its business through all of these evenings, indifferent to the specific ironies being enacted in whatever restaurant or living room the Osborns and their guests happened to occupy. Spider-Man swung through the same streets that the Green Goblin would later patrol. Peter Parker shared meals with the man who had become his greatest enemy. Harry sat between them and felt, without understanding why, a quality of tension that he attributed to the general difficulty of his father's personality, and that was in fact the tension of two people, each concealing something significant from everyone in the room, including each other. The web of connection and concealment that would eventually produce catastrophe was being spun in the ordinary course of dinners and conversations and the small, unremarkable transactions of people who are in each other's lives without yet fully knowing what that means or what it will eventually cost them. Obsession, in its early stages, is nearly indistinguishable from interest. It has the same quality of sustained attention, the same tendency to return to its object across the interruptions of ordinary life, the same capacity to generate new questions from every answer it encounters. What distinguishes obsession from interest is not its intensity, which can be identical, but its direction of travel, the way that interest opens outward toward the world, while obsession curves inward toward itself, becoming gradually less about its nominal object and more about the person doing the observing, about whatever need or wound or unresolved question the object has been recruited to address. Norman Osborn's relationship to Spider-Man followed this trajectory with a precision that would have been clinically interesting to observe from outside and that was, from inside, simply the organizing principle of his increasingly focused inner life, the axis around which everything else arranged itself with the inevitability of planets finding their orbits. The interest had been present from the beginning, from the earliest awareness of Spider-Man as a significant presence in the city's ecosystem, but it had been, in those first weeks and months, a professional interest of a particular kind, the assessment of a significant variable in an environment Norman intended to dominate. Spider-Man represented the most capable obstacle that the Green Goblin's operations were likely to encounter, and obstacles of that caliber deserved careful study. This was a reasonable and even admirably rational position, and Norman held it with the conviction of someone who believes he is being entirely pragmatic, which is the most comfortable way to hold a position that is quietly becoming something else. The studying continued. The assessment accumulated detail. And in the accumulation of detail, in the increasing specificity and intimacy of Norman's attention to everything that Spider-Man was and did and represented, the pragmatic assessment became, without any single moment of transformation, something that pragmatism alone could no longer account for. What Norman found, the more carefully he looked, was a figure whose existence raised questions that were not purely operational. Spider-Man was not simply a capable opponent in the way that a well-designed security system is a capable obstacle, something to be analysed and circumvented through the application of superior intelligence and resources. He was a person, or at least the expression of a person's choices about how to be in the world, and those choices had a coherence and a quality that Norman's enhanced analytical capacity kept returning to, with an attention that went beyond what strategic necessity required. The wall-crawler operated without institutional sanction, had chosen a masked identity that precluded public recognition, dedicated significant personal resources and apparently considerable physical capability to the protection of people who would never know who had protected them and could offer nothing in return. These were not the choices of someone seeking the conventional rewards of power, and Norman, whose entire adult life had been organized around the pursuit of power and its associated recognitions, found the alternative they represented simultaneously incomprehensible and persistently interesting. The incomprehensibility was genuine. Norman could follow the logic of almost any human motivation he encountered with the facility of a mind that had spent decades analyzing what people wanted and why. But Spider-Man's apparent indifference to recognition, to the accumulation of credit and status that Norman had always understood as the natural destination of significant capability, produced a genuine analytical gap that his enhanced intelligence kept trying and failing to close. He could generate explanations, of course. He was not short of explanations. But each explanation, when he examined it against the available evidence, turned out to account for some of Spider-Man's behavior while leaving other parts unexplained, and the part that remained consistently unexplained was always the most important part, the quality of what appeared to be genuine commitment rather than strategic positioning, of someone who was doing what he did because he believed in it, rather than because of what it would produce for him. Norman had not encountered many people of whom this could be said with confidence, and the experience of encountering such a person was more disorienting than he would have expected. The recognition that Spider-Man and the Green Goblin shared certain structural similarities was one that arrived in Norman's thinking during a late-night session on the glider, moving through the upper air of the city in the private hours when the streets below had thinned to the small population of the genuinely nocturnal. Both of them were masked. Both operated outside conventional structures and institutional frameworks. Both had made choices about the use of extraordinary capability that diverged from what ordinary social expectations would have prescribed. These were surface similarities, and Norman was too sophisticated an analyst to mistake surface similarities for substantive ones. But they pointed toward a more interesting question about what it meant that two such different expressions of extraordinary capability had emerged in the same city at approximately the same time, and what the relationship between those expressions might reveal about the nature of the capabilities themselves. This was the question that the obsession was actually organized around, though Norman would not have articulated it in precisely these terms. It was not, at its deepest level, a question about Spider-Man. It was a question about Norman Osborn, about whether the choices Norman had made about the use of his own extraordinary capability, his intelligence and his resources and now his enhanced physical capacity, were the inevitable expression of what he was or the contingent result of what he had become under particular circumstances. Spider-Man represented in this private analytical drama the possibility that the same raw material could be organized differently, could produce something whose relationship to power and recognition and the claims of other people was structured along entirely different lines. Norman found this possibility both fascinating and threatening, in ways that he was not entirely willing to examine directly, and the threat was, paradoxically, part of what kept his attention so continuously engaged. The early encounters between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin, following the initial contact that had established the terms of their opposition, developed a quality of ritual that Norman orchestrated with considerable deliberateness. He was not, in these encounters, simply fighting Spider-Man in the ordinary sense of attempting to defeat an opponent through superior force. He was conducting a series of experiments, each designed to reveal something specific about how Spider-Man thought and moved and made decisions under conditions of escalating complexity and pressure. The bombs and the glider and the various environmental factors Norman introduced into each encounter were not primarily weapons in the conventional sense, but instruments of observation, designed to generate information that could be analysed afterward in the laboratory, with the same rigour Norman brought to any experimental protocol. What the experiments revealed, accumulated across multiple encounters, and reviewed with the analytical distance that the laboratory provided, was a profile of Spider-Man's capabilities and decision-making that was more nuanced and more impressive than even Norman's initial assessment had suggested. The physical capabilities were extraordinary, not merely in their raw parameters, but in the integration of those parameters into a fighting style that was genuinely innovative, that used the wall-crawler's particular combination of strength and agility and spatial intelligence to produce movement patterns that Norman's predictive models consistently underestimated. But more interesting than the physical capabilities, because more relevant to the deeper questions Norman was pursuing, was what the encounters revealed about Spider-Man's psychology under pressure. The most significant finding, emerging across multiple encounters with a consistency that elevated it from observation to conclusion, was that Spider-Man was most dangerous not when he was operating from a position of advantage, but when he was operating from a position of apparent disadvantage, when the circumstances of an encounter had produced conditions that would cause most opponents to become defensive or conservative or simply frightened. In these conditions, Spider-Man did not contract but expanded, brought more creativity and more resourcefulness to bear rather than less, seemed to draw from some internal reserve of commitment that the pressure of difficult circumstances activated rather than depleted. Norman found this characteristic both analytically significant and personally resonant in ways that the analytical framework alone could not fully contain. He knew something about what it meant to draw from deep reserves under pressure. He had been doing it his entire life, or had believed he had. What he was not sure he understood was the nature of the reserve that Spider-Man drew from, because it did not appear to be the reserve of ego and ambition and the need to prove that Norman had always drawn from, and its different character produced different results in ways that his models kept trying and failing to fully predict. The psychological dimension of the Goblin's campaigns against Spider-Man acquired, during this period, an increasingly sophisticated character that reflected both Norman's growing understanding of his opponent and the compound's continuing influence on the part of his mind that was most interested in domination, expressed through intelligence rather than force. He began to introduce elements into their encounters that were designed not simply to test Spider-Man's capabilities, but to destabilize his psychological equilibrium, to create situations that engaged the emotional commitments alongside the physical ones, to make the encounters cost something that went beyond the merely physical. The civilians he occasionally involved in these situations were instruments of this strategy, present not because Norman had any particular interest in them, but because Spider-Man's relationship to innocent bystanders was one of the clearest and most predictable things about him, one of the few absolute commitments that Norman could reliably count on to shape the wall-crawler's behaviour regardless of other variables. The use of civilians in this way was something that the part of Norman's mind that had once been reliably ethical would have categorised as unacceptable. And the increasing ease with which the Goblin's psychology set aside this categorisation was one of the more significant signs of how far the compound's effects had travelled from their original destination. Norman was aware of this, in the detached way that he was aware of most things about himself, aware that the inhibitory structures that had previously governed certain categories of decision were less robust than they had been, that the calculation of acceptable means had been recalibrated in ways that the pre-accident version of himself would not have endorsed. He was aware of it and did not stop, which is the definition of a particular kind of moral deterioration, and the fact that he could observe it with such analytical clarity while continuing on the same trajectory was itself one of the more disturbing aspects of what the compound had done to him. The first systematic attempts to discover Spider-Man's identity were conducted during this period with a level of resource commitment that reflected how central the question had become to Norman's conception of what the Goblin's relationship to Spider-Man was ultimately about. The mask was the thing, the central irritant, the feature of Spider-Man's existence that Norman found most persistently aggravating, not because it prevented him from knowing who he was fighting, but because of what it represented about the relationship between the two of them. Norman had removed his own mask, in the deepest sense, through the accident and its aftermath, had allowed something that had always been present beneath the surface to become the primary expression of what he was. Spider-Man wore his mask in the other direction, concealing beneath it something that Norman increasingly suspected was more interesting than the mask itself, more relevant to the question he was actually asking, which was not who is Spider-Man, but what kind of person chooses to be Spider-Man, and what that choice reveals about the nature of the choice itself. The investigative resources Norman deployed were considerable, and were applied with methodical patience rather than urgency, because Norman was not yet at the stage of his obsession where urgency had overtaken strategy. He employed private investigators whose professional discretion was guaranteed through the usual combination of financial incentive and the implicit understanding that what they were being asked to do was not entirely within the parameters of what their licenses authorized. He deployed Oscorp's access to various databases and informational networks in ways that were technically within the company's authorized usage and practically well beyond it. He spent significant portions of his own enhanced cognitive capacity on the problem during the laboratory hours, constructing and testing hypotheses against the available evidence with the same rigor he had once applied to chemical problems, building a profile of who Spider-Man was likely to be from the outside in, from what could be observed about his behavior and his capabilities, and his apparent knowledge base toward the identity that would be consistent with all of these things. The profile that emerged from this process was suggestive rather than conclusive, pointing toward a range of characteristics that significantly narrowed the universe of candidates without yet identifying any single person with certainty. The scientific knowledge that Spider-Man's various improvisations in their encounters had revealed, the engineering sophistication implicit in the web shooters and their applications, the apparent youth that his movement pattern suggested, the geographic familiarity with Queens and Manhattan that informed his navigation of the city, these elements assembled into a picture that had internal coherence without yet having a name attached to it. The name would come, but not yet, and Norman's patience with the process reflected the understanding that premature identification was less valuable than certain identification, that the knowledge he was building toward would only serve its ultimate purpose if it was complete rather than probable. In the meantime, the encounters continued, each one adding to the archive of observation and analysis that Norman maintained with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understands that understanding its opponent is the most important preparation any campaign can undertake. Spider-Man swung through the city below and remained, for now, his own person, unknown and therefore in his most important sense still protected, still capable of the kind of unencumbered action that the mask made possible. Norman watched and studied and waited with the compound humming in his enhanced mind and the obsession organizing everything else around its quiet, consuming center, and somewhere in the same city, entirely unaware of the quality of attention that was being directed toward him from above, Peter Parker went about the business of being Peter Parker, taking photographs and attending classes and visiting with Aunt May and worrying about money and being Spider-Man in the hours when Spider-Man was what the city needed, carrying his own burdens with the particular mixture of humor and genuine moral seriousness that made him what he was, which was the answer to every question that Norman Osborn's obsession was actually asking, though neither of them knew it yet. And so we leave Norman Osborn here, suspended in the moment before everything becomes irreversible, the city spread beneath him and the obsession turning quietly in his enhanced and aching mind. His story is not finished, but we have followed it far enough tonight to understand what it is really about, which is not madness or villainy or the dramatic collision of hero and enemy across the rooftops of New York. It is about the distance between who we are and who we might have been, about the wounds that wait patiently inside us for the conditions that will finally give them their expression, about the terrible cost of a life organised entirely around the need to prove something to a world that cannot give us what we were actually looking for. Rest now, and let these themes settle gently into the quiet of wherever you are. The story of power and responsibility, of the masks we wear and the ones we remove, belongs to all of us in the small ways that matter most, in the daily choices between generosity and withholding, between connection and control, between the person we perform and the person we actually are. The city's quiet now, the web is still. Let yourself drift into the deep and peaceful dark and sleep.